Financial markets today roiled by Donald Trump and the chaos he has unleashed on the American economy. The Dow is down more than 2%, around 900 points today, after Trump, in an interview on Fox News, refused to rule out a recession. Watch those comments.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition because what we're doing is very big. We're bringing wealth back to America. That's a big thing. And there are always periods of, it takes a little time. It takes a little time. But I think it should be great for us. I mean, I think it should be great.
Should be great. Markets didn't think so, clearly disagreeing with that. Spooked by what Trump called there a, quote, period of transition. All major stock indices are now below the levels they were when Donald Trump was inaugurated. That may be one reason why in that Fox interview, Trump said this, quote, you can't really watch the stock market, end quote. A sudden about face from the kinds of things he said during his first term, when markets were his most favorite metric. Today's sell-off and investor concerns are focused around one thing, that Trump's policies, which often come with sudden and surprising reversals, is sending the economy into a recession. New York Times reports this, quote, President Trump inherited an economy that was, by most conventional measures, firing on all cylinders. Wages, consumer spending, corporate profits were rising, unemployment was low. The inflation rate, though higher than normal, was falling. Just weeks into Trump's term, the outlook is gloomier. The sudden deterioration in the outlook is striking, especially because it is almost entirely a result of Trump's policies and the resulting uncertainty. Tariffs and the inevitable retaliation from trading partners will increase prices and slow down growth. Federal jobs cuts will push up unemployment and could lead government employees and contractors to pull back on spending while they wait to learn their fate. Deportations could drive up costs for industries like construction and hospitality that depend on immigrant labor. A Trump-induced sell-off in the financial markets amid fears that Trump policies will cause a recession is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard is here. Also joining us, MSNBC columnist, author of the newsletter To the Contrary, Charlie Sykes is here, and chief political columnist, host of the InPolitic podcast for Puck, MSNBC national affairs analyst John Heilemann is here. Vaughn Hilliard, what is he doing?
I think it's a good question because the strategy is not exactly clear, other than President Trump and his cabinet over the weekend suggesting that there are going to be long-term gains. Of course, what are the objectives and the gains that they are seeking is difficult to exactly explain to the American public at large. And I think Kevin Hassett, his chief economic advisor yesterday, was pressed on the reasoning of some specific tariffs, and he equated the reciprocal tariffs that they plan on enacting in the weeks ahead against various countries, including allies, as being part of a trade war. But when asked about the border or about the Mexico and Canadian tariffs that the administration has implemented, he suggested they were not being implemented because of trade practices, but because of border enforcement. And so that is where you hear Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, just yesterday on Meet the Press, suggest defiantly that the U.S. was not heading toward a recession. But then hours later, you have President Trump aboard Air Force One not go as far as to be able to guarantee that, suggesting that there could be very well disturbances to the greater economy on the way. And that is where a great many promises were made by the then candidate Trump on the campaign trail in 2023 and 2024. And yet, what would the ultimate consequences of it be in 2025? And how would an administration respond to those consequences? That is the question that is before us today. One other note, though, Nicole, I think that it is important because we haven't heard from the president today responding to today's dramatic stock market drop-off. Last week, the S&P 500 dropped by 3%. And if you go back in time, in 2019, when he was in office, the stock market fell one particular day, and he blamed the Russia impeachment hoax on the stock market falling that day. And then a year ago, there was a good day on the stock market. He wasn't in office, but he said it was because Americans were expecting him to get back into office. And then you go back to last August, there was that day in which the stock market fell right after Kamala Harris had ascended to the top of the ticket. And he and his campaign went out and called it the Kamala crash. Of course, that was a one-day event, and that was not what would play out in the weeks that followed. But here we are in March of 2025, and we have heard very little from the White House in terms of how or whether they are going to seek to correct course on this, or whether the stock market's reaction to the economic decisions being made by this White House are essentially going to be short-term consequences, and they're going to continue to articulate a message that there will be long-term gains.
Steve Mnuchin seemed to have a coalition with Mr. I think Gary Cohn was in there as well, where they could speak truth to Donald Trump and stave off cataclysmic days like this for everyone who watched their retirement savings plunge, for everyone whose livelihoods are tied to America's economy, which is everyone. Does this speak to the weakness of the current economic cabinet members?
I think Howard Lutnick is, I think, been the biggest cheerleader Donald Trump could find during the cabinet meetings. He was the one who heralded the accomplishments of President Trump. And when you look at Scott Bessent, his Treasury Secretary, just on Friday, when he was asked about on CNBC about the strategy behind the tariffs being implemented and then some tariffs being rescinded, he called it an organic decision-making process, effectively acknowledging that it's an hour-by-hour, day-by-day decision coming out of the White House. And I think that that is also where I think Kevin Hassett is such an interesting figure in all of this. He was there during the first Trump administration. He was the one who is at the forefront of negotiating NAFTA 2.0, or the USMCA trade agreement, at the direction of then-President Trump. Fast forward 6 years later, it's Trump, now president again, who is seeking to have Kevin Hassett, the man who negotiated USMCA, go out and explain how the United States is getting ripped off by Mexico and Canada under the very trade agreement that he and Kevin Hassett negotiated 6 years ago. That is where it's very difficult to try to explain exactly what the goals are and the objectives are, because the individuals around him are going out onto TV, yet have struggled in a way that is starkly different than even 6, 7 years ago during the first trade war, to explain what the priorities and the mission is of the tariffs that they are placing on these American companies from bringing in these imports.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is there anyone in the cabinet who previously or prior to January 20th advocated any of the policies they're now on TV shows defending?
I mean, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said that there would be a much more tactical, precision-type tariff policy that would be implemented by this White House. And he was somebody that was never a fan of tariffs, yet President Trump selected him to be his Treasury Secretary. And we have seen everything but a precision, tactical approach to tariffs. And we have seen him, in response, go out and defend the across-the-board sweeping tariffs that the president has directed him to enact.
Charlie Sykes, I think what Vaughn is saying is no, but weak weenies wreck economies. And the weak weenies that make up the economic advisors to Donald Trump have never on public record advocated for any of the economic policies that have been ushered in over the last 5 weeks. Your thoughts?
Well, this has been Donald Trump's obsession for decades now, right? Using tariffs to punish our trading partners, and he's unburdened by advisors who will tell him no. And so what you're seeing playing out is the world going, okay, we thought you had some clue of what you're doing, but this is disastrous. And, you know, this goes back to one of Donald Trump's obsessions back in the 1970s and the 1980s. And in the past, there were people around him who were able to say, no, don't do this. This is not this, you know, to pick a trade war. Nobody wins trade wars. But this is Trump unshackled, doing exactly what his id tells him. And I think you're seeing the consequences of it, that in fact he is serious. And it is interesting to see how they will respond to the markets, because I think that the markets have been generally supportive of some of the things that he's been talking about, but certainly not this. And now there's this recognition that he's going to go ahead despite the economic consequences of imposing these tariffs.
Heilman, your thoughts today?
Well, first of all, Nicole, thank you for starting off by talking about weak weenies, something I've when thinking about the cabinet, not something I really thought I'd ever have to contemplate.
I've got so much more where that came from.
I mean, in question.
Weak weenies wreck economies. Weak weenies also wreck NATO and aid Putin. But I don't want to get ahead of myself.
Sure. Sure. I mean, it actually plays into my favorite thing, which is alliteration. It's the weak weenies, and this is the week. Last week was the week that Wall Street woke up. A lot of alliteration from anxious analysts placed in powerful posts. Here's what I think. I think that what Charlie said is, I think what Charlie said is really important. I think, this is just of a piece with everything else we're seeing. Trump is being Trump now. And Trump, I would actually say, I agree with Charlie 100% that this is Trump unbound. This is what he wants to do. No one's going to stop him. No one's going to hold him back. The guardrails are gone. You can't blame Scott Bessent. Scott Bessent's a serious person. Peter Navarro, who's not in the cabinet, but is obviously... He's not really even an economist, but is also someone who's been important in Trump's thinking about economics. He's been someone who's advocated trade wars in the past and blanket protectionism. But I agree with you that there's not a long record of the people in the Economic Council, if you want to call it that, of Trump, who've advocated blanket across the board, on again, off again. We don't know what's going on. Tariffs, no one thinks that's a good idea. But here's the reality is that Trump has been a mercantilist and a protectionist his entire life. He has, as a businessman, throughout his whole career, this is the stuff he has said. He said it back in the 1980s. He said it in the 1990s. He said it in the 2000s. He thinks that somehow there is that going back to an older version of the economy that doesn't exist anymore. He wants to basically roll back globalization and try to turn America into a purely domestic market where we make stuff for Americans. Americans consume that stuff, and that is a better version of the economy than the version where the entire world is knitted into this kind of inextricable web that we're in now, where free trade over time has shown itself to be the best way forward for global prosperity and for American prosperity. Trump does not believe that. He wants to, as I said, go back to that other version. And I think it's not just his id. I think that you might call him a pea brain, but that is a thing that he has been mentally committed to for a long time. It's not surprising.